Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our next episode from the Lessons from the Playroom podcast. I am so excited about what we are going to get into today with our amazing special guest. It's a topic that we've never addressed in this episode series, and it's actually a topic that I don't hear talked about a lot. I'm actually struggling to remember a time when I've actually heard it actually talked about in the world of play therapy. And so I'm sure it has been, but clearly not enough. And so I'm so grateful to have our special guest with us today. If you are settling into this episode, please have something to write with, to take some notes. This is definitely going to be one that's going to be worth some note taking. So let me go ahead and introduce this amazing special guest who I've known for many, many years now. And we have shared some profound conversations about the world that she lives in and the world that I am in therapy, and how we can do some blending. So I have with me Mila Golovine, and let me just share a little bit about Mila. She is a professional interpreter, which interpreters is going to be what we are going to talk about today, using interpreters, understanding interpreters. She is familiar with the toll interpreting for survivors may have on interpreters themselves. For the past 15 years, she has applied her training in trust-based relational intervention therapy, synergetic play therapy, and trauma-informed care, as well as skills as a master certified neuro-linguistic programming practitioner, a certified DiMartini method facilitator, to tirelessly help promote health and wellness for language professionals and raise awareness about the experience of human trafficking survivors and their language access needs. So I'm going to keep sharing some things about Mila, but I just want to pause and say Mila is one of the few in the field of interpreters that is attempting to bridge the gap between interpreters and having a trauma-informed approach. So Mila, thank you for your vision, really, for bringing this to interpreters. So Mila has a company by the name of MasterWord. You're celebrating your 30-year anniversary this year, and are committed to providing trauma-informed services, and have launched training and tools for language professionals, as well as trauma-informed providers who work with language professionals to foster a partnership that creates an environment conducive to healing and avoiding re-traumatization of survivors. I'm going to keep going just a little bit longer because I think this is so important. She's an advocate for social justice. She's a nationally and internationally recognized speaker. Her work has been recognized by numerous awards, including California Healthcare Interpreting Association Trainer of the Year Award, Houston Business Journal's Women Who Mean Business Award, Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year Gulf Coast Area Regional Winner, and Congressional Recognition G7 Excellence in International Service Award. Mila.
That's a lot.
It's a lot, but you know what? You are out in the world tackling some really, really needed and big service needs. So thank you for your vision and your heart and what you're bringing to many, 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 many people around the world.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So Mila, I brought you on because the use of an interpreter, we know that it happens in the play therapy world, but as I mentioned, there's not a lot of training for play therapists to understand what the interpreter experience is, or how to attune or work collaboratively with an interpreter, so that, because the ultimate outcome is to help the child heal. I mean, that's the ultimate outcome in this. But we know that there's impact on both the clinician, but there's also impact on the interpreter also, which I hope we'll get into today. So can we just start with, will you define what an interpreter does? Like what is the role of an interpreter?
Before we do that, let's even take one step back. And not many people know that there's over 7,000 languages spoken today. That's not dialects. That's
Wow.
languages. And for sign language, there's over 300 sign languages spoken today.
Wow.
There are regional variances, and they have like sign language in America is actually very different from sign language in England. It's more similar to the French sign language. So they have a lot of regional differences and different variations. So when we encounter a person or a child, and a child, of course, has family members, we want to identify what is the primary language of comfort for them. And the best way to identify that is, are they just responding in simple sentences? Yes, no. Or are they able to give us a comprehensive response? And if a person is not able to give us a comprehensive response, then most likely that person is not comfortable communicating in English. We're going to use English as a primary example, but if the main language of your country is Spanish or Arabic or German, in the main language. So that's kind of like the first cue. Of course, if you have a person coming in doesn't speak any word, that's obvious, so they may request an interpreter. That's also obvious. But if a person is speaking some of the main language, then that's a cue if they're not expressing themselves fully. Another cue to keep in mind is that we regress under stress. Mm-hmm. And when we regress under stress, a person who was fluent in let's say English may completely forget it in the moment. And one of the examples was a lady who had a older lady who had a car accident and actually was absolutely fluent in English, to the extent that she was teaching classes at the University of Houston in English. But in that very moment, she could not communicate in English, what is your name and can you find a driver's license? So she needed linguistic assistance. So a person under stress may regress, and if you are seeing lack of understanding or lack of comprehension, you absolutely want to have an interpreter. Mm. And then for sign language, there is an additional distinction, because if there's a concept of certified deaf interpreters. So not everybody would speak, let's say, American Sign Language. There are people who grew up in very small rural communities, or who, because of their particular type of trauma, may have been isolated and are speaking in a homegrown and made-up sign language. Or because of high distress, are also having difficulty communicating in, again, American and Mexican Sign Language. And a certified deaf interpreter is actually a deaf person themselves, and they are trained in that complex communication. And then they will interpret into American Sign Language, and you'll have what's called a relay, where then an American Sign Language interpreter will voice that communication. So you may have an encounter where, for purposes of communicating through language, you have either one person or sometimes two people involved.
Okay, so that's super interesting, because what I'm hearing you say is that the first thing that we can do as therapists is to become aware of the language that is most comfortable for our clients, and not assume that whatever language is being spoken is, and maybe if it matches ours, that's actually the language that's most comfortable, which from a trauma-informed perspective is super interesting, because we're working with trauma, and trauma involves regression. And so that's a really interesting thing, I think, for play therapists to consider, that we're working with a client and then they're regressing in session potentially, but then we're expecting them to rely on the language or use the language that's not actually their language of comfort, which what I'm hearing you say is they may not even have access to the language that's not in their, that's not their primary, their native language.
There's another very interesting piece, and that is we interact and think differently in different languages. Mm-hmm. So there was a study made where bilingual English and Chinese speakers were asked to arrange pictures in chronological order. And when they were arranging pictures of that were presented to them in English, they arranged them left to right. And then when they arranged pictures presented to them in Chinese, they arranged them top to bottom. Mm-hmm. And if you stop and observe, when a person switches languages, for example, from English to Spanish, the interactions become more animate. The dynamic between the group will change. The way the comfort level of staying closer together or giving more hugs or giving less hugs will change depending on which language that person is speaking. So if you're looking for cues in play therapy setting, you may find different cues if you are speaking to that person. Number one, in their native language, and number two, in the language in which the trauma was incurred.
So fascinating. I'm just going to go back to just naming how much I'm appreciating this conversation, because there's so much happening right now in the world of play therapy about being culturally aware. And this is a piece, and I don't hear this talked about a lot. So I'm just really appreciating you right now, Mila. I'm appreciating this conversation. I'm appreciating that we get to hear this and discuss this. So, okay, so let's say that a play therapist has made the decision or has figured out using an interpreter might be really helpful in this scenario, whatever the scenario may be. Help us understand, when an interpreter comes in to help the play therapist, what's the complexity? What is that like for an interpreter?
Well, first of all, an interpreter is immediately part of the encounter. And when a play therapist nervous system becomes activated or a child's nervous system becomes activated, guess what's happening to the interpreter?
Right.
And the interpreter is also going into their own trauma. The interpreter is not trauma informed. They are going to be going back into their own trauma. In addition to that, interpreter becomes the funnel for whatever is happening. And according to our professional rules, we interpret everything in first person, just the way it was said. We don't say he said that or the child said that. We say, I have been hurt or abused or raped. And then as a result, actually an interpreter's processes information different than the person witnessing the trauma, because we take a linguistic concept and we have to process it in our brain and then live it through the first person. So interpreter is called channels the trauma through them, channels the information through them. And as a result, sometimes becomes even more deeply affected than the therapist in the room.
Yeah.
So that becomes part of a very interesting dynamic. And on top of that, during an interpreting encounter, an interpreter is also becomes the bearer of good news or bad news. And as a result, ends up being very deeply affected by whatever is the dynamic, by guilt, by shame, because very frequently an interpreter becomes that focal point. And sometimes, in case of very intense encounters, a patient may actually confuse the therapist and the interpreter, and the boundary has to be reestablished. And so it's very important on who is leading the session, who is focusing, how you're focusing the session, how the session is set up. So setting some rules, or what we call a pre-session briefing, what to expect in the session and how to behave, is very important.
I'm hearing that it is really important for the play therapist to be aware that they're asking somebody to come in to the session and relive the trauma in a way to help them understand what the child's going through. That's a big ask.
That is a very, very big ask. And an interpreter is frequently going to be affected by their own trauma and bearing their own trauma on top of that. So if interpreter does not know what to expect, we want to make sure and be very aware, is the interpreter within their window of tolerance or not?
Yeah. This is where I've appreciated our conversations about the idea of the play therapist, being an external regulator, where the play therapist can support the child and maybe even needs to support the interpreter. So, play therapist, please hear that. If you've got someone in the room, you have another nervous system in the room to attend to. There's another nervous system that's trying to support you. So, how do you also support the interpreter also and be attuned to the interpreter? And then what you and I've talked about is then how do we support the interpreters and also learning how to be external regulators in moments, because sometimes they're facilitating a tension point, between the people that they're facilitating. So maybe they're the one in the moment, or Mila, what you just said is so true for therapists too. Therapists get activated in their own trauma. So what if that's what's happening, right? Is that the interpreter is interpreting, and now the therapist is outside their window of tolerance, or the therapist is getting emotionally flooded, and the interpreter may need for a moment to be the external regulator for the therapist, and for the child. And I just am hearing the need for awareness and the need for attuned collaboration between a play therapist and an interpreter if they're facilitating healing for the child.
Absolutely. And then other important things to consider are we do not want to use family members as interpreters.
Mm-hmm.
And that is because anybody who is aware of familial trauma or familial abuse knows that a family member may be actually a person causing the trauma. Will a child be open in front of their family member and about what's going on? And in Asian cultures, there may be a deep sense of shame that they don't want to communicate that, or there may be a deep sense of fear. Actually, any culture can be affected by shame, but certain cultures are more stoic about not expressing anything that happens inside the family than others. So you want to make sure that you have an interpreter that is not a family member. You also want to make sure that if it's a very let's say small minority or demographic, like let's say you live in a town where there's not a lot of Bulgarians, and a Bulgarian family comes in, well, that in-person interpreter in that case may be very connected with the community. They may know them at the grocery store, at the church, or some other type of, be seeing them at the holiday gathering. So in that case, you want to engage an over-the-phone interpreter or a video remote interpreter, which may not be ideal for a play therapy session, but will be ideal in case this is the time when somebody wants to share certain very sensitive information.
Mm-hmm. Or I'm thinking a parent check-in, or if there's a family session where a conversation needs to happen, or in a play therapy session, if it's a session where it's a bit more direct and it's a bit more conversational, I could see how that would be incredibly useful.
Well, let's talk about the parent check-in.
Yeah.
Because the majority of textbooks are written from the perspective of the Anglo culture or individualistic culture.
Mm-hmm.
But 70% of the world is actually collectivistic culture. Mm-hmm. So we want to take into perspective that approach. And what is typical for a collectivistic culture is the majority of the people who come from collectivistic culture are what's called high context communicators. So what does this mean in the context of play therapy? If you ask me as an Anglo person and you say, hey, what's going on with me? And, you expect an answer, well, I have a headache, maybe had a bad day. But if you ask somebody from a high context communication culture, I may suddenly come to you and start telling you my whole family story. My great grandmother used to have headaches, and I will carry on and carry on. And as a therapist, you may think, okay, what does this have to do with anything that's going on? But if you do not take those few minutes to listen to that story, you actually break trust.
Mhm.
Versus if you take those few extra minutes and you listen to that story and you engage with that story, you build trust, and that becomes the foundation for the rest of the communication with the family member and actually the child.
Mhm. Absolutely. I want you to explain a little bit more about the challenge that interpreters have in the interpretation process itself. So one of the things that you have helped me understand is that it's not just language that's different, right? There's different cultural cues and things that are different also, and body language can be different, and some things are the same, some things aren't. So if you have a play therapist who is watching the child say something, but the therapist doesn't understand what the child is saying, and all they're reading are body cues, and then the interpreter says something and the therapist is like, no, that's not what they said, because that's not what my interpretation of those body cues mean. Can you explain that process a little
Okay,
bit?
so micro expressions are more or less universal, but body language is different. And the biggest difference would be the way we say yes or no. And we know that here in the US, when you nod your head up and down, that means yes. And when you nod your head left to right, that means no. But it's in Bulgaria, it's absolutely reverse. Nodding your head left to right means yes. And nodding your head up and down means no.
Mhm.
And then the context of eye contact. In this culture, in Anglo culture, it's if you want to talk to me, if you're paying attention, look me in the eyes. If you respect me, looking in the eyes. But in many cultures, looking somebody in the eyes is actually a sign of disrespect.
Mhm.
And it will be out of respect that the child is avoiding eye contact, which will be very confusing because sometimes we avoid eye contact because we may be outside of the window of tolerance, we may be differently activated. So we want to read we want to read the cues in that context
Mhm.
and then smile.
Mhm.
Okay. Here in America, we smile to each other a lot.
Mhm.
But if you go to, for example, Russia, there are just as many jokes about how smiling is a sign of stupidity. You're actually not allowed to smile on your passport photo, and you may get fired if you smile in a business meeting because it can be viewed as an insult.
Mhm.
So a person not smiling may be not a sign that they're not happy. It may be just a sign of them respecting you.
Mhm.
And yet, somebody from an Asian culture, a smile may be a sign of incredibly high distress.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it's not because they're happy that they're smiling, it's because the person is actually just about to exit that window of tolerance.
Mhm. So, would you recommend if a play therapist had an interpreter and what the interpreter was saying didn't seem to match the child's body language? Would you encourage after the fact, like what would you encourage a play therapist to do in the moment?
I would encourage them actually to go with your advice and stay in that being curious mode. I
Mhm.
wonder why
Mhm.
is a really good question at that time, and maybe exploring it a little bit more so you can get a big deeper understanding of where it's really coming from. And
Mhm.
when we talk about cultural diversity, what's important to know, it's not just culture between countries.
Mhm.
We have age culture, we have urban versus rural culture. So a kid from a very rural area in southern Mississippi will not be acting the same way as a child in the center of Chicago.
Mhm.
And again, you want to read, you want to stay more curious longer, and you want to explore that a little bit longer.
Mhm. Yeah. So let's take this into a play therapy session. So I have an interpreter that's with me. The interpreter is supporting the child and and me. Um, back to, as the play therapist, I need to be aware of the child. I also need to be aware of the interpreter. What happens, Mila, if, as the therapist, I observe the interpreter is going outside their window of tolerance? Or I observe that the interpreter is starting to get emotionally flooded? What recommendation would you have for the play therapist on how best to support an interpreter in those moments?
Again, a lot of this needs to happen in the pre-session briefing.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going into a session, you may want to get the interpreter come there a little bit earlier and spend the 15 minutes explaining the setup, explaining that a child may get emotionally activated, and explaining what to do. So you want to set those protocols. And if the interpreter is going outside of the window of tolerance, my guess would be they're now affecting the child in the playroom. So suddenly you are regulating two people, and now you are regulating a bigger playroom. So your audience is suddenly a little bit bigger. And so now you need to dive into the box of tools that you, Lisa, are offering on how to regulate that.
So is that what you would suggest? So if I was observing that, let's say you were the interpreter, Mila, would you suggest, as I'm noticing that I would take a moment as the play therapist, I'd ground myself, maybe take some breaths. Might I say something to the interpreter, or might I invite a pause for a moment?
You can invite a pause. So we have two training classes for interpreters. Number one, how to deal with vicarious trauma, that we offer for free on our website, because it's our mission and goal to educate interpreters. So we actually do offer tools for interpreters how to regulate. And we also have a training class on trauma-informed interpreting. If you want to share that with your audience, they're available for our website. Ask your interpreter to take those two classes.
Go ahead and name the website.
It's MasterWord.com, MasterWord Institute, and we can share the link with your audience.
That's great. I think that's a beautiful thing. If play therapists, if you're going to use an interpreter, maybe offer them those resources ahead of time. Okay, so keep going. So
the best thing is that the interpreter is trained and prepared. And we actually did prepare a course dealing with aggression in an interpreting encounter that was based on what happens in the playroom, based on your book, Lisa, and specifically adapting what can an interpreter do and how can an interpreter understand if aggression gets escalated. So again, that's another course that we have available. They can take the course. And so as a play therapist, you want to have a bigger set of tools with you in that moment. But I also want to address a couple other cultural concepts that are different. And that is, so there is a concept first of all, there's a concept of time. How many play therapists would think that, we all think in what's called linear time? And that's the Anglo concept. There's also a concept of what's called the multi-active time. And that is when we plan something, we really are more focused on accomplishing our goal, accomplishing the result, and the finish and end is less important. We've probably all experienced an invitation to a Latin American party where an invitation is for 7 p.m. and nobody's there till 9. And then you don't know when the time the guests leave is also undetermined, which is going to be very different than a party, let's say, in Germany or in an Anglo setting in the US, where everybody shows up on time and the ending time is announced. So what happens in the perception of a parent or a child from a culture that operates in that time is, if a goal was not accomplished and you have to finish the setting, that's again when the trust can be broken. So there's some way that you want to manage that expectation. But what's also important to understand that in some cultures, there is actually no tense for future and past times. So in a so in the Malagasy culture and in some cultures of Peru, if you want to point to your past, you're actually going to point in front of you. And if you're going to point to your future, you're going to point behind you. And that is because the future has no eyes and you cannot predict the future. Guess how you're going to develop a plan for the future with that culture? And in languages such as Hopi language, which is one of the indigenous Native American languages here in the US, or Mayan languages, there is no linguistic tense for past and future tense. So as an interpreter, when we're talking about let's develop a plan for the future sessions, I don't have a way of expressing it linguistically. And the concept of time, the concept of long-term planning may be very different. So now overlay that on somebody affected by high level of trauma who has their linear perception of time messed up, their memory is interrupted, and that becomes a rather complex environment to navigate.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes. Totally. Just keep going back to play therapists. Please be aware of your interpreters. Please be aware of this astronomical task that they are pulling off, and that if they are struggling, how do you support them in that process, and be mindfully aware. Oh my goodness, yes.
Another important aspect to consider is trust or distrust of anybody in a position of authority. So there's two parts to that. There is power distance with in the Anglo culture. There we are used to what's called the short power distance, the low power difference, right, and the high power difference. So here we have low power difference where we can be very direct, and at the same time, we're used to being able to express our own opinion. But in the opposite situation where we have high power distance, we're actually expecting a person in a position of authority to tell us what to do. And what happens is when that person doesn't, we get outside of our comfort zone. Again, that's important consideration when you are engaging a parent or not engaging a parent in making plans. That may come across, if you are not cued into that, that may come across as you don't know what you're doing. So there is another area to navigate. And in the case of many cultures, there is a distrust to any person who, let's say, a policeman, or in a position of authority or a government official. There's a very interesting study made. They actually questioned 15,000 managers across 28 countries, and there was an ethical dilemma. A person supposedly not affected by trauma was asked if they were a passenger in a car driven by a close friend and he is driving over 35 miles over the limit, would you lie in court to protect your friend? And of course, in the US and in the UK and in Germany, 95%, more than 95% of the people said no, they wouldn't lie in court. But in countries such as China, India, Venezuela, Korea, most of the people said that they would. And that comes from, it is more important to protect your friend than to preserve the truth. And how does that come into this dynamic? For example, a child who may be about to disclose what's going on, if they feel that they're disclosing what's going on to a person in a uniform, they may completely shut down and not disclose it. Whereas if the person was able to build trust with them, and they see that as a person that is now kind of part of their inner circle, then they're more likely to come out and disclose what's going on.
I'm hearing another piece here that is important for play therapists. So if I'm going to bring in an interpreter, I'm guessing, I'm making an assumption here that I would know what language that I would need an interpreter for, or at some point that would need to be assessed.
Mhm.
But I'm hearing there's a little bit of a call to action here for play therapists that once you know what the language actually is, that it's actually part of the responsibility of the play therapist to go get informed, to not just have everything also just be like, not just rely on the interpreter to not only help us understand what's trying to be communicated, but to also navigate all the cultural differences and all the perceptual differences. That there's also a little bit of a call to action here that I'm hearing for play therapists of go do your due diligence to learn a bit about that culture, to learn about some of the norms or expectations that could potentially apply to what's happening in that space. Um, would it be considered appropriate for the play therapist to also ask the interpreter, for the interpreter to help them understand some of
Absolutely.
the dynamics that really may need to be
Absolutely.
aware of?
A debrief after would be very helpful as well to go what happened, how do you read the situation, how did you perceive the situation, and again a debrief before, is there anything specific I want to know. So
Mhm.
just asking a person on how do you say hello in your language,
Yeah.
what does your name mean, somebody comes in and says a very long name that's hard to understand, what does your name mean, and it may mean something very important in their culture, and that's that step of building trust, that's that extra step.
Mhm.
What is also interesting to consider, at least, is you talk a lot about threats, right, and how we get activated based of threats and based of those perceptions and the unknown.
Mhm.
In the cross-cultural communication, there's a thing called the attribution bias. So if you are doing something that I'm not accustomed to, for example, I'm going to, if you are having dinner and you suddenly made a loud burp,
Mhm.
you may perceive that in the Anglo culture that that's not very polite. But if you're certain Asian cultures and you didn't burp,
Mhm.
you actually did not appreciate the meal. That
Mhm.
is a way to express that the meal was really good. So what is going to happen in that setting is you're going to be feeling awkward that one of us burped, and the other person is going to be feeling just as equally awkward that the other person didn't.
Mhm.
Attribution bias works both ways.
Mhm.
So the moment you as a therapist caught yourself in that uncomfortable situation of going, oh my God, this child in front of me is acting really weird. They're taking their shoes off all the time, or they're putting them on all the time.
Mhm.
Remember that that child is perceiving you the same way,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
the opposite. The
Why
opposite
why
side,
are her shoes on? Why does she never take her shoes off?
yep, that she's being so rude.
Uh-huh.
So that is the moment to explore
Mhm.
and maybe go, oh, you're taking your shoes off. What does this mean? Oh, that's the polite way. That's the way we always do things at home.
Mhm.
Bingo, let's take your shoes off too, so that now you are you're not triggering that attribution bias both ways.
Oh, it's that just yeah, just another layer. So brilliant. Mila, as we are moving towards a wrap up point here, if you could highlight, in your opinion, what you feel like the important takeaways are uh, for a play therapist in this conversation, like from your perspective, like play therapist, I really want you to think about this, this, and this, and this. What would you, what would be your call to action to us?
Well, my call to action would be, I actually want to offer one solution, because you don't know what culture is in front of you. You're not an anthropologist, but there is one kind of solution that works universally across all situations. And that is, just as well as we can smell fear or perceive fear, we can also smell love.
Mm.
And
I,
if
well,
you,
I just hold on. I don't even want to move on from that. I want you to say that again because that's so.
we can smell fear but we can also smell love. And that is something that is universal. Doesn't matter what culture you come from, what's your body language, what's your trauma, we can smell love.
Mm.
And so if you occupy the space in the room with an open heart, that automatically creates that healing environment, the perception of safety that overrides whatever else is going on.
Mm. Mm. So good. So good. Yeah. Okay.
And then there is a list of takeaways, mind. And so those would be kind of stay informed about the context of where the patient is coming from and their experience. Be very aware about differences. Very important, recognize your own biases. The moment you have experienced a bias, that is the exact same moment where the child in front of you, the parent in front of you, is also experiencing that bias, that uncomfort, that perception of threat. Right? So be very flexible with your communication style. Allow a little bit more time for the interactions from the people from the collective cultures. Allow a little bit more time and follow what Lisa's teaching everybody, and that is be curious. That's probably one of the best things.
Awesome. And then I'm going to piggyback on those from the ones that I heard. Play therapists, be an external regulator for your interpreters, collaborate with them. Take the time to appreciate and understand the role that they're playing when they're in the room. So it's not just, oh, this person's here to help me and the child. No, no, no. They're actually co-facilitators of the session at that point. They are co-therapists actually in many ways, co-healers. And so take the time to consider them, think about them, appreciate them, hold them, attune to yourself, attune to them. In SPT language, I recognize that you now have 3 nervous systems in the room that you have to attend to: your own nervous system, the child's nervous system, and the interpreter's nervous system. So, yeah, this is such a powerful conversation, Mila. Such a powerful conversation. And as I mentioned, I just haven't heard this talked about uh, uh, in the way that you're talking about it. And just this idea of, for play therapists, how do we think about interpreters and how do we think about the use of interpreters? So thank you for shining a light on a topic that needs to be talked about. And thank you for all you're doing to help interpreters be trauma informed, so that when they do step into the play therapy sessions, that that they're ready and they're prepared, because there's a lot that happens in a play therapy session. There's a lot going on. So, everyone, if you would love to learn more about Mila's trainings, if you know interpreters that you'd like to suggest different trainings towards, please go to masterword.com. You will find the MasterWord Institute, which is where all the trainings are offered. And Mila, any last words before we wrap this up?
Well, remember to lead with an open heart.
Yeah, beautiful. Lead with an open heart, and I love what you said. They feel it. The us showing up with an open heart is the most important part of the whole process. So, listeners, thank you so much for tuning in from wherever you are in the world. Remember to take care of yourselves. You are the most important toy in that playroom. Until next time.